Good evening and welcome. It's Friday evening. This is Jennifer Reynolds. I'm your host for our armchair travel journeys. We've been going to some pretty fun places recently. Jennifer's Journeys is some sessions I've developed for the month of April. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we're going to take off on a 30-minute journey someplace fun, someplace exciting. But I was born and raised in Canada. I've always worked in the travel industry. I worked as a representative for a Canadian tour operator for many years. And then I spent 18 years of my life living and working on cruise ships. I love this photograph in particular, and I still have this jacket in my closet. It says MV Silver Cloud, where I was the shore excursion manager for a number of itineraries. I've been very fortunate. I've traveled a lot throughout the world, both on cruise ships and through land. My late husband, was an oceanographer and a historian and a lecturer, and I developed a very deep passion and love for these subjects. And I'm just delighted to be able to share some of them with you during this rather unusual period of time in our lives. It's certainly been a wonderful little escape for me. So tonight in our Jennifer's Journeys, I want to take you back to some place we went a couple of weeks ago. It's a place that deserves revisiting. It's a place for those of us that have been there. And there's just over 50,000 of us a year that get to this place. We want to go back. For many others, you too want to go to visit the last continent, the seventh continent, the Antarctic. And in my years in working on board cruise ships, my first exposure to the Antarctic was indeed, as you see in front of you, when I ran shore excursions on board the Silver Cloud. These folks would each pay me $1,300 per person, and we would fly over the Antarctic Peninsula. We would cater from the ship the champagne and all the food. We would tilt our wings and look over at the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was just an exquisite sight. And I wanted to lay my eyes on this so badly, knowing that it was the last continent, as far south as you could go. And since I was a little girl, I'd known about this place and wanted to experience more. So the first step was the chance at doing this flyover, which was really incredible. Then I had an opportunity to do what I call a drive-by experience of the Antarctic on a larger cruise ship. My husband was the scientific lead for one of the larger cruise ships down here when the Antarctic was just sort of beginning to get a little bit more popular. So my second trip to the Antarctic was with Stu, and that photograph was actually taken on the bridge of Oceanus Nautica as we were sailing through Neptune's bellows on our way into Deception Bay. The Antarctic is exquisite, and I'd seen it by air. I had seen it from a ship because you can't do landings on a bigger vessel. And this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to see it and smell it and taste it and feel it and get really close to what I thought the Antarctic was all about. But what I really wanted to do was also knock out the seventh continent off of my list. And I did that last year in December. And without a doubt, it was some of the most exquisite experiences and periods of time in my life. I still wake up pinching myself and saying, did I really have that experience? I got back December 30th, rolled through January, a little bit of February. In March, my house was robbed. In April and March, all of our worlds have changed so dramatically. And frankly, I've escaped back to the Antarctic, and I'm just so happy that all of you are joining me to have a quick visit there. But our world is confusing. Our travel world is getting more exceedingly confusing and complicated, but that's not going to stop any of us from traveling and from visiting our world, because that's what we do. To me, traveling is as important as breathing. I would just as soon travel or do a trip. I'll measure things in cost of, well, gee, that's a new sofa, or that could be a trip to Europe. Folks will go out for dinner. I'll put my money into a travel fund, because life is about experiences. It's not about stuff. And what I've realized is the value of a travel professional, people who know it, who've been there, who've seen it, who knows the ins and outs, because our world is changing really, really fast. and the polar regions are really special. I've had a special love for the polar regions for a long time. I call myself #polar-possessed. But I want you to look at the map in front of you, the North Pole at 90 degrees north, the South Pole at 90 degrees south, the equator rolling right through in the middle. I'm going to grab my little pen here. For any of you who've spent some time with me, you know I have a love of geography and a ridiculous love of history as well. But let's look at the equator that splits our world in the middle right here, and then continue south to the South Pole at 90 degrees south. The Antarctic Circle at 66.5 degrees south is mirrored by what? By the Arctic Circle at 66.5 degrees north. The Arctic, Arctos from the Greek word, Antarctic, anti-Arctos for the Antarctic. And there's some pretty significant differences between the two. The Arctic is basically water surrounded. The Antarctic is an actual continent surrounded by ice. This is what the Antarctic looks like. The peninsula on the upper left-hand side is where the majority of people are going to travel to. You're looking at South America here, and we were just looking at our degrees of latitude and longitude, and what is 66.33 right down here, rolling right through. A big deal to get down to the Antarctic Circle, or if you're up in the Arctic, to the Arctic Circle. These are really critical things to understand. When you're going to the Antarctic, most people are going to go through Argentina, through Ushuaia. You can get there from Australia and from New Zealand, but the majority of visitors are to the peninsula that you see jutting out. And I'll refer to a number of different maps and topographical things as we go throughout. But let's start with appreciating the size of the Antarctic. There you're looking at Australia, including Tasmania, laid over top of it, 5.5 million square miles, or 10% of the surface of the Earth is here in the Antarctic continent. 99% of it is a permanent ice cap. And for those that are visiting the Antarctic, these are pretty much the choices that you're going to make. We're going to look at this for a moment. A lot of people will start in Ushuaia right over here. Think about the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas. Historically, these are fantastic. I've been there a number of times. South Georgia Island here. These are thought processes when you're planning an itinerary. If you want to do the Falklands in South Georgia, you're going to have to add more time to the itinerary. Majority of itineraries are going to go right down here into the Antarctic Peninsula. If you want to go below the polar circle, there it is right there, 66.3. And I never got there. It's close. I was just within a couple of degrees, and I want to go back and cross that polar circle. The Ross Sea at the bottom end, this is a little more hardcore, a little more expensive to get into. 98% of tourism you're going to find is going to go into the Antarctic Peninsula right up here. And yes, there is the South Pole. Anybody visiting down here is going to be doing it between November, December, January, February into the early part of March. That is summer season in these parts of the world. My friends, you're looking at the coldest, driest, and windiest place on Earth. It's also one of the most exquisite. It's also one of the most hardest to get at. It's been a place of mystery and imagination for many for so many years. And for the 55,000 or so that get there every year internationally into Buenos Aires, bear in mind that there's two airports in Buenos Aires. There's AEP, and then there is the international airport, and then AEP, which is the local airport. Some flights will go down into Patagonia. People may do pre or post Antarctic trips. Highly recommend it, but it's pretty tough to beat an experience down on the ice. But the majority of journeys you'll find are going to go in and out of Ushuaia. Do you want an itinerary that includes the Falkland Islands or South Georgia? Coming back over here, and we're going to look at these in a bit more detail, touching the South Shetland Islands, which is very common, before going into the Antarctic Peninsula itself and the ever-famous Le Maire Channel. These are decisions, these are options. It depends on the people, the experiences you're looking for. Ships now are offering camping and kayaking, hiking and snowshoeing for hardcore. There's even scuba diving. There are treks now that even go into the South Pole. But I learned a long time ago we need to qualify expedition. Expedition for some people, especially after this month, may mean from walking from your house to the post box. For other people, expedition may mean crossing crevasses or exploring Alaska. It is relative to individuals, but this is what you'll find on a fairly regular itinerary out of Ushuaia down to the South Shetland Islands, then kicking around the Antarctic Peninsula for however number of days your journey is that you choose to go. You can also fly now from Punta Arenas in Chile. You fly over the Drake Passage, that famous body of water you pray is the Drake Lake. It is indeed one of the most roughest bodies of water in the world. But you know, my mom used to say to me, if you want to play, you got to pay. And so many explorers who came to the Antarctic, that's how they came. For most of the ships, this is how they come. But there are other itineraries now which are charter flights from Punta Arenas into the South Shetland Islands, and those are only charter. There is no scheduled service. Another way to get down here, of course, we're talking cruise ship right now because there's no other way to do it. You could do a drive-by like I did a number of years ago. We started over in Chile, came down the fjords, went to Punta Arenas, Ushuaia, dropped down into Montevideo, like dropped down into the Antarctic Peninsula and came up the other side. So here's some choices of vessels. It all started, you know, with icebreakers and expedition ships, Russian icebreakers, and don't knock it till you try it. You can still get a bunk on a lot of these ships. Many of the vessels that are down here these days are still doing scientific exploration. It's not every scientific ship that can get here, so passenger carrying vessels are going to be doing scientific operations. Any of the passenger carrying vessels are going to be pulling plankton. They're going to be checking clouds. They're going to be counting birds. You can do the icebreaker at the bottom. You can go up to the top. That's the ship I was on, which was called the Island Sky, 114 passengers. For any of you old shippies out there, that's the old Ren 5, those old Renaissance ships that keep popping up in an incredible amount of places. You can do Antarctic on a big ship. Royal Caribbean does them. Celebrity, Holland America. Hurtigruten has a wonderful experience there. The old Silver Cloud on the bottom right-hand side, I have a particular affinity for that ship. I was shore excursion manager on her for several years in the 1990s, and I'm just delighted to know that a coat of paint, and back she is kicking out down in the Antarctic, and she's still going strong, and so am I. And you can go really foo-foo if you want as well. There's some really high-end stuff down here, but you're looking at about $1,000 per person per day to start to play. But here's what you need to know right in front of you. All human activities in the Antarctic are regulated by the treaty. Here's 2 rules you need to clearly understand when making a choice. First of all, no vessels larger than 500 passengers are allowed to make a landing. And then secondary to that, 100 people at a time are allowed off a ship. That's why you use a travel professional, friends, because there's a lot of choices to be made down here, and we want to make sure that we get you matched up to the right place, to the right people, to the right ship, to the right experience. This is what I did. In fact, on the right-hand side, that's my actual itinerary from the bridge itself. When I looked at this, I'm going to grab my little guy here again. We came out of Ushuaia. Sailed across the Drake Passage. It was about a day and a half across the Drake Passage. Actually, we came this way. South Shetland Islands, we're going to look at this. And then over to the Antarctic Peninsula where we kicked around. I was a total of 5 days on the ice. And then about a day and a half to get back to Ushuaia again. From there, there's just so many things that you can do. And that is kind of what we're going to look at today. Let me move forward there. Ushuaia, amazing place. Loved it. Had gone in a number of times when I was a Shorex manager on the Silver Cloud. The pier looked exactly the same as it did in the late 1980s. A magnificent place. There's lots of activities to do before or after a voyage. All the ship's provision here. It's incredible to think that you're picking up everything that you need for 10, 12, 14, 16 days in the Antarctic, and you're getting it here in Ushuaia. Ships generally will sail late day, 5, 6 o'clock in the Beagle Channel until about midnight, and then you're in open water on the Drake Passage. The Drake is an exquisitely rough piece of body of water. It's the convergence of a number of oceans coming together. It's one of the reasons, and that roughness and the plankton in the water is what makes this so exquisite. But I was very fortunate on this particular trip. It was like glass. In December, these are the longest days of the year. Remember, there is no sundown here for about 182 days of the year. And this was our deck day with our cameras, with the birds, with our lecturers, with our enrichment people. Gotta tell you, I had no idea that I could go as bananas over birds. And I've got some images a little bit later on for you. But here's what a typical sea day kind of looked like. Breakfast up in the morning, chats and activities, an opportunity to get together. Vessels will operate and offer kayaking, another reason why it's important to work with a travel professional. Some ships will offer kayaking to everyone. Others will only offer it to a select number of individuals, and those same people go out every day. There's advantages to that, and there's significant disadvantages as well. As my dad would say, one man's nightmare is another man's, is another man's paradise. Let's talk about Antarctica, the rocks and the geology. Let's talk about the geography, the history. Briefings in the evening. We were not roughing it out here. The ships are really very nice. You can't go wrong with an expedition team. These are folks that are extraordinary in their field. They have paid their dues. They are unbelievable, and they go between ships. They're a small community unto themselves. They're Canadians and Americans and Scots and Brits and ornithologists and glaciologists and geographers. They're people that work in the Arctic in the summer. They're people that work down here in the winter. These are people that may operate a kayaking operation in British Columbia. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some of these guys turning up on the Great Lakes with some of the new itineraries that we've got up there. Cool people like Paul Hart, who was a military guy who crossed the Antarctic wearing cross-country skis. And as we jokingly said, Paul would throw himself into a crevasse just to have a good time. And David Hartman, who I became very fond of, he was a Canadian like I am, and so many people with so many images and stories and a passion for what we were experiencing. You gotta want to go to this place. December, January, February, in March, steaming southbound, finally coming into the Shetland Islands, the South Shetland Islands. And I point these out because some of you will know about the Shetland Islands, but they're not here. We're going to look in a minute at a bit more information on Deception Bay. But there's a lot to be said for this archipelago. It's a chain, and it extends over 300 miles, and it's only separated by 60 miles from the actual Antarctic Peninsula itself. There are 11 major islands here, a few other outgoing islands, but one of very big significance on the upper right-hand side called Elephant Island. And an anniversary of Elephant Island is coming up in just 3 days on April 14th. And that is when land was first sighted, and that's the story of Shackleton and his crew members who survived in the Antarctic with the Endurance having been crushed by ice. And it was Elephant Island that they finally made it to. So not only is this place about animals, it's about the people, history of it. We went ashore here on Livingston Island. The topography is entirely different. It reminded me a lot more of Alaska. You can see the rocks. You can see how the glacial moraines have actually retreated. The Weddell seals were everywhere. These guys were out here. They are molting. They go out and they feed and they fill their bellies full, and they do not go back into the sea until they have molted completely. And it's here where you can be walking along the beach. You got to pay attention to where it is you're going, because you could find yourself a lot closer than you want to be to some of these seals. Out of Livingston Island, there's a particularly interesting place here called Deception Island. And a lot of people would like to visit Deception Island, and some of the itineraries here are able to go to Deception Island. Here's what you need to know. It doesn't matter where you go here, it's a win-win for everyone. Tourism is controlled. Weather is a massive, massive factor. And the other thing is often new sites are being found, which is kind of fun to be a part of. But this is Deception Island. It's credited to Nathaniel Palmer in 1820. It's a basaltic volcano. It's an 8-mile wide crater, just under that, about 7.5 miles wide. And this is Neptune's bellows, 1,600 feet wide. You can see the bow of the ship as we were approaching. And this was when that photograph I showed you from Stu approaching Neptune's bellows. People think it's only animals we come down here. It is a lot more than that. The first scientific work was done here on Deception Island by Henry Foster in 1828. He did magnetic experiments using pendulums, which is why Pendulum Cove is called what it is. Port Foster is named after him. But Deception Island has, and I just love aerial shots with these maps. This is a neat shot. Looking back, you can see Mount Pond over on the right-hand side, and then you can see it from overhead. But Deception Island has really had a very varied human history activity, whaling exploration, scientific research, and more recently tourism. Deception Bay now is managed as part of the Antarctic Treaty System, and it's protected with human visits, and it's not lost on the impact that we all have on these particular environments. But the history of Deception Bay goes back to some of the first ever human use of the Antarctic, and that goes back to the 1820s, primarily with whaling, or sealing. 1820s started with sealing. They sealed out the area. They did a great job and killed and managed to kill all of the seals. By the early 1900s, nothing was left. What did they move to? They moved to whaling. And so Whalers Bay right in here is a sheltered, shallow area. There's a big, wide beach. And until about 1931, I'm sorry to say, Whalers Beach and these areas in Deception Bay were used for whaling. It's a big collapsed caldera. Sometimes you'll get a chance to have a swim inside the caldera. The water's warm. Back on board the ship. No matter what vessel you're on, unless the navigation bridge is doing something that they really can't afford to have any company on the bridge, you will find an open bridge policy. Meals on board are really good. Just make a point to let folks know ahead of time if you're gluten-free or there's something that you don't eat or you don't like for lunches or for dinners. We were able to take a lot of meals outside, and I would like to dispel any myths at all that it's just too darn cold to get down here. There's my friend Lori and I. We had more than one lunch outside. And, you know, I look at that photograph and I'm looking at a ring on my right finger and a necklace around my neck. And since that photo was taken, my house was burglarized in March, and that jewelry was stolen from my house. And it's interesting to look at these photographs and realize that those robbers can steal those things from your home, but they can never steal these memories from your heart. They can never take away the people we've met, the experiences that we've had, and the folks that we got to interact with. These expedition leaders, at least a dozen of them on board our ship. There was Michael from Vancouver. Well, he was in Victoria in British Columbia. I wish he had been my science teacher when I was in high school, because I think all of us probably would have embraced a lot more science. And he talks about things like plankton in the oceans and the geography and the geology and the oceanography. And one of the things that makes the Antarctic so incredible is this thing called krill and plankton. It's always blowing me away that the largest critters in the ocean eat the smallest things. And where do these smallest things thrive? in these nutrient-rich, undisturbed waters of the Antarctic. So on daily visits and going out in a Zodiac, always with these incredible expedition leaders, this is what you're going to see: ice formations that are hundreds of thousands of years old, cetaceans as they come here to feed, the views of watching a whale bubble net where they dive down and exhale little bits of air, and that air gets closer and closer, and they dive up into the middle and have lunch. And what was the radio call from one guide to the other? They're lunching over here. These baleen whales, they don't have teeth. Baleen whales filter all of the water out, and all that krill gets stuck behind. And they do this again and again and again and again. They feed here, and then they go up north into Alaska off of Mexico to feed. This is how you can spend your days a couple of times each day looking for penguins, over 78 million of them in the Antarctic. But what you see depends on what time of year you go and exactly where you go. We saw a tremendous amount of chinstrap penguins, and yes, we saw them with chicks as well. It was a phenomenal experience to see the mothers go out, come back, have the food, and watch the little chicks tickle the throat, and the mother would regurgitate and feed the young one. Oh, they were loud. Oh, they were smelly, and there was just tons of them everywhere. But let us remember that there were guys like Shackleton, that there were guys like Scott, who put their whole lives into Antarctic exploration. And I know everybody knows about Shackleton and the Endurance, but I encourage you to take a look at a book called Forgotten Footprints. It really talks about many of the lost stories and smaller individuals who spent time here, lesser known explorers, if you will. Kayaking is really a terrific option, and you think you might be looking at black and white images, but you're not. The only color you're going to see is the lichen, because nothing lives here. We had families, and we had kids, and we had singles who were traveling with us. We saw a tremendous amount of seals. Wanted to see a leopard seal. I didn't have a chance to see one. These guys are incredible. They have an enormous mouth, and of course, they're known for their spotted coat. And if you read the Endurance, the sailors of the Endurance had more than one run-in with leopard seals. These guys are really solitary, aggressive, and just mean, mean, mean. So from the South Shetland Islands over Bransfield Strait, it's only 60 miles over to the Antarctic Peninsula. Get on the water. If you can do it, get on the water. The experience was incredible. And this is what a day would look like, a Zodiac cruise on Fournier Bay. And that would have just been in the morning time. Our landing at Ornay Harbor, that would have been in the afternoon. Evening time with a recap and briefing, always a nice drink in our hand before we get ready for dinner. Presentations and discussions on Shackleton and Scott. I still can't believe they asked me to choose which one I thought was a better leader. That's like asking a woman to choose between which of her children are her favorite. But it's really getting in about science. What is it? The climate, the geography, the geology. What can we all do that can make a difference in this part of the world? The stuff you're seeing and the ice that you're laying your eyes on is ice that other people, nobody else in the world will ever lay their eyes on this. Like an emerald iceberg. That actually is an iceberg that has tipped over or flipped, and that is plankton and all the good rich stuff from the water that's collaborated and stuck on the bottom of it, and it's flipped over. Another daily itinerary. Landings in the morning, landings in the afternoon. You saw those screenshots a moment ago. Grabbing some ice. I love the fact we call this black ice, even though it is as clear as a bell. And why is it called black ice? Because when you look at it in the water, you can see all the plankton through it, and it looks so dark. And there's our ship right there in the background, the island sky. The polar plunge. Most people on board did the polar plunge. As one person said to me, when you have a chance to have an experience, just say yes. But one of the greatest days of my life was the day that I reached and walked on the Antarctic continent. That is the seventh continent. It is right there. It is under those rocks. And it was a moment that completely brought me to my knees. Once again, there was just penguins everywhere. We see the chin strap. They are masters at thieves when it comes to rookeries and rocks running from one to the other. And I love that shot with the snow and showing our ship in the background. I didn't know I could get excited about a snow petrel or an albatross, but I've developed such a phenomenal love for these birds, these albatrosses, these critters that live on nothing and that will fly here just on the wind. And then knowing that this ice is alive and it's moving and it's shifting, that there are glaciers the size of Manhattan that are falling off, that are changing our world as we know it today. But man, the whales, I'm sorry. When I go down here, it really wanted it to be a lot about whales. Saw a lot of minke. We saw a lot of humpback whales, and these were photos from our trip. Absolutely love this one. And what you might know, of course, is that you can recognize the tail of a whale. Each one is individual, much like our fingerprints. If you can get a good enough image of a whale tail, get it, upload it to Happy Whale, and see if your whale is traveling. It's an individual thing. These whales' footprints, their tail prints are in the database at Happy Whale. They can match your photograph and see if your whale perhaps was in Alaska or has been identified, or maybe it's a new whale to science, because that's what happened on our journey. We found a new whale to science. There's a lot of protocol. There's a lot of procedure that goes on here, which is really important because these are resources that have to be looked after. As mentioned earlier, there are only ships no larger than 500 are allowed to have passengers disembark, and only 100 passengers at a time are allowed to go ashore. The 1961 Antarctic Treaty was, of course, commemorated with this stamp. I would love to get a hard copy of that stamp someday, but for now, I hold that one in front of me as something I may be able to find. But this place is really, really, really incredible. Nobody lives here. The largest iceberg that came off of here was the size of the country of Belgium. And I'm just not sure that we're capable of wrapping our heads around the majesty that exists here. That Antarctic convergence is that artificial line, if you will, that really separates the men from the boys or the cold from the tepid. Once you cross that Antarctic convergence or divergence, the water temperature drops 3 to 7 degrees. Depending on how far south that you're going, it gets colder, obviously, the further south you go. And it becomes a game to discover the first iceberg. You can see on the left-hand side that was our actual sightings. Those are the animals that we saw, the gulls, the terns, the mammals, the storm petrels, the whales, and the dolphins. My suggestions to you that are thinking about going here, bring a humidifier. It was very, very dry on board the ship. Dress in layers. Do your homework. Watch your movies, read your books, get to know your animals, and it's not a myth. Hand warmers are a really, really magnificent thing to have. Good binoculars are wonderful, but don't obsess over your photographs. Your ship will probably have a photographer on board who'll make sure you get everything that you need. A weird thing to say, but watch the size of your sunglasses. It can get very painful when you're pulling hats over your eyes. But in terms of dressing, most ships are going to provide you with a boots and waterproof jacket. You're going to bring waterproof pants and fleeces and thermals, but it's really not that difficult to dress for the Antarctic. You start with a base layer, 1, 2. Hey, I'm a Florida girl. I didn't even own closed-toed shoes. You add a second layer to that base layer, and then you add a top, up top, obviously. And at the bottom, I added a pair of fleece, which frankly I've been wearing down here in Florida during the month in April. If not the fleece, these other pants I got from REI were really, really magnificent. Back up on top again, a nice fleece jacket or a lightweight jacket. And then the bottom right, those ever-present water pants. You're going to need those waterproof pants every time you go ashore. So a base layer, a second layer, a fleece, pair of pants, and then your waterproof pants are really going to be everything that you're going to need. Cuddle duds will probably be your best friend. I had no idea what cuddle duds were. And I did spend about $800 before I went on travel, which is probably, if you don't have much in your closet, that's probably going to be what it'll take for you. So as we come to a close this evening, I say thank you to all of you. I've run a little longer than I intended to, but it's such a magical place, our incredible Antarctic. And this year there was just 55,489. And when I say this year, I mean, well, I should say this most recent season, which ended in December of last year. So that number in 2006 was about 7,000 people a year. So we've seen an increase to over 50,000 people from 7,000 in a very short period of time. In our time together recently, we've gone to a number of destinations. We went to the Galapagos. If you joined me last month, we had a quick transit through the Panama Canal, a little time in Italy, specifically some more time in Venice. Fantastic. Ireland, an amazing destination, Machu Picchu, and the Peruvian Amazon. And if time permits, join me on Monday. We're going to look at the Bermuda Triangle, something a little bit different, something historical related. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday till May 1st, same time, same link. And on Monday evening, we will look at a little historical story about the Bermuda Triangle. Hashtag travel strong, my friends. To travel is to live. This is Jennifer Reynolds. I'm your host of Jennifer Reynolds Travels and our Jennifer's Journeys. Feel free to catch our content online at Jennifer Reynolds Travels on YouTube as well as Facebook. www.collagetravelradio.com also carries segments, and this Sunday at 1 p.m. we invite you to join us for an armchair journey to Antarctic, which is our topic for Sunday in our interview session. To travel is to live is to travel. This is Jennifer Reynolds. Thanks for joining me.